those individuals who are going to be persistent sexual offenders will groom, and they're very good at picking out the vulnerable individual. I had a case not long ago where the individual had offended on multiple occasions and was a groomer. And he started grooming behavior when he was a teenager. He groomed his victims as a teenager. And to my astonishment, he was allowed to be a counselor as an early adult in a youth camp. And the organizers of the camp knew of his record but felt he was cured. When you have a repeat offender, multiple victim offender, they're not cured. They can be controlled, not cured. So we do need to watch out for grooming behavior. I want you to know, teenage sexual offenders, there's a group of them who groom their victims. When you see these things occurring, your alarm bells should be going off. And what you're looking for is the kind of situation where an individual is making best friend of the weak, the socially weak and marginalized child. Okay? Now, offenders. Some offenders will immediately admit to their offense. I'm caught, yes, I did it. They're the easiest to work with, and they're the ones with the best prognosis because they own the behavior straight up. Caught, yes, I did it. By the way, as an aside, when you have an offender who admits the offense when it happened, when they're caught, they accept responsibility and they are concerned about the victim. This is the best prognosis. Because they get what they did wrong, they acknowledge what they did wrong, they take ownership of it, and they acknowledge that what they've done has hurt the victim, and they're concerned about that. That's the best prognosis. That's the group that we have the most hope for, because they bring remorse. They're sorry for what they did. And they may have shame. I really worry about the offender who blames the victim. I wouldn't have done it if she hadn't been so provocative. They worry me a lot. Because not only do they not accept responsibility, but in fact they make the victim responsible for the problem. They worry me a lot. Then there's the ones who are in denial. Well, yes, it happened, but it wasn't what she says it is. And then you get the silent ones. And the most worrisome group are the ones who think that the only problem is they got caught. Because they don't worry about anybody. They think the problem is, I'm just not a good enough criminal. I need to be a better criminal so Mr. Justice Ali never sees me again. It's not that I shouldn't offend, it's just that I just have to be better at it so I don't caught. They are the most worrisome group. Because they don't care either about the court, about society's rules, or about the victim. They just care that they got caught. Now, how do we work out who we should be most concerned about and who we should be least concerned about? So, as someone who assesses these cases, I must, and I recognize I'm about to make a comment that draws from the West. And so, one of the things I cannot do is offer India a solution. India must find its own solutions like we in Canada must find our solutions. I am very, very blunt with my assessments. I ask the offenders everything, because it is only by bluntly exploring the history that you're able to really sort out who you should be most worried about and who you should not. And by the way, the worst source of information is the offender, because they're really worried about Mr. Justice Ali and what he's going to do. So they want to say, oh, no, I'm really actually quite good. I only did this once. You need to interview family and other important people in the offender's life to really understand what's going on. Because I want to know the degree to which they take responsibility, and I want to find out how many victims there are. I had a case recently where the offender told me that there were 2 victims. And then by the 3rd interview, there were 4 victims. By the 6th interview, there were 6 victims. And then when I finally obtained a full copy of all of his records, there was a notation in his records that said there were 10 victims. The story kept changing. So, it's when we use other sources of information. I worry about offenders that watch a lot of pornography, by the way. Because what does pornography teach us? It teaches us that women, and I hope I don't offend, but this is the lesson of pornography. Women are always wanting it all of the time and should be available for the whim of the man whenever he wants it, under any conditions. That's the lesson of pornography. So an offender who watches a lot of pornography is walking around with some very disturbed messages. In risk assessment, now actuarial risk assessment is the best method, and there are several methods. This is just one, and I'm not attempting to make you an expert on utilizing a method. I just want to illustrate how we go about looking at the idea of actuarial assessment. Now, does everyone know what actuarial is? Because you actually have actuarial experiences all the time. Okay? So, how many people here have an automobile or a motorcycle? Just hold your hand up if you do. Okay? Is it insured? Yes? And how does the insurance company determine what kind of a premium they should charge Mr. Justice Ali instead of Vidya Reddy? How do they determine that? They look at the frequency of people who are Mr. Justice Ali's age versus the people who are Vidya Reddy's age. They look at the driving record of people who fall into various categories, and they say the probability of Vidya Reddy having an accident is high, medium, or low. That's actuarial assessment. What is the probability, based upon certain factors, that the offender will reoffend? There is no zero. We are incapable of predicting individual behavior to the point where we could say there is no risk. So when we deal with somebody who has already offended, we are talking about high, very high, medium, or low probability. So let's look at the kind of factors that we take into consideration. And the good news is that soon I will be done and you won't have to listen to me too much longer. Okay? This is usually at the point my students go, yes! He's almost done! So, it's a little hard for me to read. So I'm just going to, if I move the microphone, can I turn it this way and so I can just see the screen? Is that okay? All right. So, we're looking for what is the record, first of all, what is their history of sexually deviant behavior? All right? And so we want to understand that and what is the degree of preoccupation they have with this behavior. In other words, what we're looking for is the individual who has a persistent attachment to this sort of behavior. And these are just a series of factors that we ask about in order to determine that. Okay? The more victims that exist, by the way, you'll notice that I also talk about the degree to which there is a history of other offenses. Because the more criminal behavior there is, in addition to the sexual offending behavior, the higher the probability of problems. Okay? So this is just one way in which we begin to contemplate and look at this. We look to the degree to which as well that they are a victim as well. So what I want you to get from this is just the idea that we look to the degree to which they are fixated and they are preoccupied with that. Next, we are looking at the degree to which they are impulsive. In other words, what we're looking at is the degree to which they can or cannot manage themselves. Let's face it, one of the most important lessons that we try to impart to children is how to regulate their own behavior. So we're looking about the degree to which they are not capable of regulating their behavior. To what extent do they think through what they are doing as opposed to act on impulse? The more they act on impulse, the more concern. The more they are willing to not honor society's rules, the greater the concern. Next, we're looking at the degree to which they can be responsive to control. Do they feel empathy for the victim? Do they have remorse? Do they have guilt? What are the quality of their other relationships? So in general, do we have a youth who has a number of healthy relationships, or do we have a youth that is very isolated and has poor quality relationships? We're trying to understand that, because that helps us to understand, is there a healthy system for the youth to be connected to, or is the youth quite disconnected? What's the quality of family relationships, good or poor? What's the quality of the sibling relationships? So we're trying to understand, in addition, what is the degree to which they have good relationships, and what's the degree to which they are likely to be responsive to Mr. Justice Ali's orders. Next, we're looking at the community stability and their adjustments. So we also want to know how well are they connected to the community. A youth who has positive connections in school or community activities or other relationships in the community and lives in a healthy environment is a kid who's going to have lower risk of reoffending. That helps us to understand, by the way, an important point, and that is the quality of what we do in the community really matters. The more we have programs that support children in healthy activities and healthy relationships, the better we're going to do with this, with this group. Now let's talk about accountability. I just have some ideas up here. As I've said, without consequences, then there is simply permission. Now, how many people here are parents? If you just hold your hand up if you're a parent, okay? You know that if you say to if a child spills the milk and does it on purpose, and you don't get the child to clean up and take responsibility for it, then the child will likely spill the milk again and not care. Well, why is that different with a sexual offender? If we don't say to the sexual offender, you must not do this and we are going to hold you accountable, then they will repeat the offense. So, what we're attempting to say to the offender, if you offend, we as a society will hold you accountable, and will do so within what is available in the law. And that's going to be different from country to country. What I just want to do is to say, look, you can't say to a sexual offender, oh gosh, that was a mistake. Don't do that again. Go home. The moral transgression is too big. You must get their attention and understand whether they get it. You can't just sort of slap them on the wrist. So each judge, and I think one of the most difficult jobs in the world is being a judge, because you have to sit and decide on the merits of what you hear, and you have to apply the law. I think you have to be Solomon, and you have to figure out some of the most difficult challenges. How do I deal with the offender? How do I determine guilt? How do I weigh the evidence? But once we have determined that there is guilt, how do I construct an order which will cause this person to decide reoffending is not worthwhile? How do I apply the law? And how do I decide who is going to be I need to be the strictest with versus those I can be less strict with? And the ideas in the previous slide, I hope, give some idea as to who you need to be strictest with. Those, by the way, who are least likely to follow the rules, you need to be the strictest with. That's really the point of that. And those who have clinical histories, those who have histories of multiple offending behaviors, that's just a summary slide just to kind of bring it all together. So, more of the same. Okay? Leave that one up if we would. So let me finish this way, and I think I've probably pushed my time to its limit. I know that in every society, sexual offending occurs. If you look at the literature from around the world, there's no country that doesn't report sexual offending. I know it's a very difficult topic. I know it's an uncomfortable topic. But if we, in all of our societies, do not have a conversation about sexual offending, then how will things change? I'm going to tell a story of my own childhood. Sister, I'm going to use the Catholic Church because I grew up in the Catholic Church, and I hope you will forgive me for using your church for this example. I grew up in a very Irish Catholic family. My mother was very Irish, and she was very Catholic. I grew up at a time when she believed, as did most of her generation, that the clergy were as close to God as possible, and if they did anything, they did it almost with the direct permission of God. We went to confession every Saturday, Mass every Sunday. We ate fish on Fridays. We fasted during Lent. In other words, it was an environment in which we lived in a fairly strict Catholic home. You could not come into my home and talk about the abuse that was going on in the school that I was sent to. In fact, the order of clergy that ran the school would subsequently be charged in a number of countries with sexual and physical abuse of children. It was a scandal that ran through the order. But we were not allowed to talk about it because in the family I grew up in, the community I grew up in, talking about this was not permitted. So we had no voice with which to tell our story. And if there is no voice, then there is no hope. And you are told, therefore, you must live with it because you are not permitted to tell. And we had no voice. As an adult, the stories started to get told. I was approached in the late 1980s by what had been a longtime friend of mine to help in the legal defense of one of the clergy who had been charged with sexual abuse of children from the school that I grew up in. My friend said, "This can't be true. We must help to defend this person." And my response was, "This must be true." And indeed, he was convicted and sentenced to jail. As part of his trial and the trial of several others from that order, came the story that in fact the sexual abuse had been known by the order for decades. But the solution was to just move the clergy from one place to another, where the clergy would just repeat the offenses again. I tell that story because I had a conversation with some men in a village last Sunday who told me that the solution to sexual abuse in a school was to beat the teacher up and send the teacher away to teach in another school. And it reminded me so much of the story of my childhood. The solution is not sending the offender away. The solution is holding the offender accountable and to give to the victims legitimacy in telling their story. To give the victims a reason to tell their story, to say to the victim, it is worth telling your story, because in telling your story we will hold the offender accountable so that the offender does not offend against other victims. That is the reason for holding the offender accountable. Supporting the offender in getting better so that they can stop offending is important. But holding them accountable so that they do not continue to offend is what the story is about. If we had been permitted as children to tell our story, there would have been 30 years of victims that would not have existed in my case, because the stories continued for 30 more years before they were told, and it stopped with that group of clergy. When we permit the story to be told, we help to prevent further victims. I thank you for the opportunity to speak. Namaste.
We'd now like to open the floor for further interaction for about 10 minutes. The audience can interact with the speaker and ask questions. We can pass the mic to you.
You had mentioned a point that victims are always guilty, or they believe that they are part of, they don't reveal their the sexual abuse story, fearing the fact that they might blame themselves that we were part of it. So are you trying to say that victims have no role to play in that sexual offense? Are they not responsible even a bit for the offense that happened or the abuse that they suffered?
So the question, as I understand it, is to talk about, am I okay to walk around a little bit? Yeah, am I okay to walk around? That's okay. I was never very good behind podiums. I hope I'm not going to drive the poor cameraman crazy. Let me start by first saying, I understand that often victims feel that they are in some fashion at fault. that they in some fashion caused it. When you start to look at the dynamics of the offense, you start to understand that in fact that's not true. I've worked with with victims, and I remember one who said to me, I thought it was my fault because I kind of enjoyed it. And when I explored that with her, what she in fact enjoyed was the offender had made her special in the family. She got special gifts. She got taken places. She got looked after in a way that the other children in the family didn't. Is she really at fault? When you look at that situation, in fact, the offender just groomed her. In my view, a victim is never at fault. But I have heard on many, many occasions victims talk about feeling like they were at fault and that somehow they had caused the problem. But once you start to take the stories apart, you begin to discover that their feeling was legitimate and it made sense, but it's not correct. But it takes time to sit and hear the story and to understand the dynamic that was at play. But guilt in the victim is amazingly powerful in keeping the voice quiet. There must have been something I did. Silence, by the way, is the perpetrator's greatest ally, because it is with silence that the perpetrator is not found. And they use the dynamic of guilt and shame to silence the victim. It's one of the things they do. So, I cannot, based upon my years of clinical experience, believe that a victim is ever at fault. But I do understand why they can feel that way. In my own story, for example, in grade 4, I was beaten by a clergy member 2-3 times a week. I believed I did things wrong. I believed it was my fault. I was this mischievous, misbehaving child. It was only later that I started to look at my behavior, and I was getting beaten for such offenses as daydreaming. But I thought it was my fault.
You agree the victims have got no roles, like as you say, but the physical abuse and the sexual abuse are two different things, sir. In a physical abuse, I agree, yes, the victim is not supposed to be blamed. They are not actively part of it. But in a sexual abuse, like rightly she says, if somebody allows the abuse for continuing more than 2 years, whatever reason it may take, whatever the emotional component, whatever it may be, like you said, no voice, no hope, and no will. Who is supposed to create the voice? It's a self. It's a self. They should learn how to say no. They should know their limitation. Just because somebody is showering with so many gifts or something, you don't have to say yes for that. But my question is, how many of the victims really know they are abused?
It's a hard question to answer, how many know that they've been abused, because so many are silent that we have been able to research the silent population. But your comment raises something that I think is quite important. How do we teach? Well, your comment raises 2 or 3 issues. How do we teach to say no? How do we have an open enough conversation with our children that they can understand the need to say no? We need to empower our children with the capacity to say no. We need to create communities where if something happens, there is the power to tell. And that means we need to create room inside families, schools, community groups, so that the stories can be told. We need to give permission for the stories to be told. But I really want to emphasize how important it is that we teach our children to be able to recognize inappropriate behavior and to say no, and then to come and tell you, do you know what somebody asked me to do? It's not just saying no, it's being able to come and then say, so then we can get to the person who's made the invitation. And we can bring a stop. So it's a combination of education in the family, education in the community, empowerment of children, and creating safe places for children to tell their stories if they occur.
That's a wonderful point. Like, everyone should have a right to speak up. Means our child should be able to tell that what happened. But do you really think, like, disclosing this issue publicly and the media that created a chaos, a story going on, the highlights in the media every time that this thing has happened, today's highlight is this. What do you really think? This impacts the life of the victim in a way that he or she would not feel like living a life for a longer period. He would or she would feel like committing suicide because people will come and question her or him because of this publicity. So what is the correct way of addressing such problems?
One is, I'm really delighted that the media is... Oh, there we go. Okay. I'm really... we're in and out. I'm really delighted that the media will write stories because that helps to create conversations. That's actually important. At the same time, we have to support victims in a way that it feels okay to tell the story. Most victims are not going to go to the media story. They don't want to go to the media. They want nothing to do with it because they have too much shame and guilt. So they're not going to go to the media. They're going to go to you and you and you as individuals and tell their stories. They're not going to go to the media. What I'm hoping in the media is what the media will do is they will help to aid the conversations about what should happen. That's what I hope the media will do. I know there's in the media. And the worst kinds of stories are the sensational stories. What that does is it creates the kind of polarization in the discussions. Yes, there are sensational stories. Heaven knows I have a ton of them myself. That doesn't help. But stories that do help us to recognize what's going on, that it is going on, and that there are things that can be done, those stories are very helpful. I don't know if I fully answered your question, but I hope I have.
Sir, you were talking about community with safety and the victim has the right to come up and say they have been offended. We deal with mental health children, where we have children who are non-verbal, who are they cannot communicate literally well. We deal with children of several age group and stuff. They get offended. They get offended in the same classroom. It's becoming very difficult for us to literally go deeper inside their class, deeper inside their emotional thoughts and to figure out what's really happening to their life. So what will be, as a social worker or as a counselor set up, what will be our approach for us dealing with offending, sex offending and people getting abused who are like special, who are like mentally retarded, mentally, held people in that state?
Favor, by the way, of specialized work. Because this is a difficult area, and the more specialized services that we have, the better. At the same time, the more opportunity that we have for children to come together and tell their stories, it's a whole into. I'm disappearing here and there, right? It's a whole other workshop to get into children. I'll go. I was going to say that it's a whole other workshop to get into the behaviors of the children and the ways in which we can use behaviors to learn how to tell the stories. Responding is a specialized area, and I think that what can be useful in the long run is the development of specialized services. That may take time for you as a social worker to get those things going, but I challenge my profession, your profession, our profession, within the profession, to raise those conversations, because part of it is our professions being willing to say, you know, there's things we could do. And so we have an obligation as a profession to have these conversations as well within the professions. And social work is, I'm a bit of a fan of social work, and I think we can make a big difference when we also have the conversations within our professions. So I think I feel the hook coming, and probably everyone's getting a little tired anyway. So
to the end of the evening's function, and it's time to say thanks, which is very important. On behalf of Tulir, I would like to thank Dr. Peter Choate for delivering an extraordinary lecture on the topic Juvenile Sex Offender Understanding and Accountability. Special thanks to Honorable Mr. Justice Akbar Ali for presiding over our evening's function. We thank Worshipful Brother Bhagwan Keswani, the Millennium Lodge number 327, for supporting the whole event. We thank our trustee, Ms. Geeta Ramaseshan, for being our mentor and support as always. A special thanks to the American Consulate Library for providing us with information pack, which provides as a further background material. And finally, thank you for being such a wonderful audience. So thank you very much.